Alright, let's start off here with Labyrinth. I've got the second edition here. I really like Volko's Wilderness War. And this is, unlike most of the times when I play something, this is not a first playing. Although, I'm getting more and more, because I play things with my wife now, into playing something maybe the second time on video instead of just a first look. But this is only my second playing, and in a lot of ways you could say, well, what the hell are you doing a video for this on only two playings? And that's a valid point. There are plenty of people who have put out, who are big fans of the game, who have put out rules, primers, and discussions of the strategy or whatever, who really understand the game. And I'm not going to give you that, and you should just turn this off and go away if that's what you want. This is primarily because on my voting list, well, one, I want to play it, and I tend to when I solo a game, and yes, I'm going to be soloing it. When I solo a game, I tend to video it, because I have people who seem to like to watch those. Anyway, that's a bit of warning on this. You're not going to see detailed, clever strategy at play here. You're going to see somebody fumbling their way through the game for the first time, or second time in this case. My wife and I played this, and my first impression as I stepped away was, wow, I don't understand what's going on. I'm beginning to get an idea of the mechanics, but she wanted to bail before we even got halfway through the deck. Basically, it was miserable for her, and that's fine. I was beginning to get enough of a grip that I felt like, yeah, I can start something and not maybe completely mess it up, I hope. So, obviously the subject of this is familiar to most people, but it's the War on Terror, starting with the 9/11 attacks. Well, not starting with them, but starting with the period right after that. And it's meant to represent the asymmetrical kind of warfare where the United States has infinite military capability, and the jihadists have essentially a worldwide insurrectionist, terrorist, or whatever you want to call it, goal in mind, where they can strike in many, many places. And you've got to kind of balance those two things. And in order to do that, the game really kind of gives different rules for each player, essentially. There's some similarities to the basic mechanism. In a lot of ways, this is shown as, or seen as, derived from Twilight Struggle. However, in Twilight Struggle, I felt pretty comfortable after one play that I could play it again, and I haven't taken too much away from it after that first play. The first play, I was bewildered, and that's the one you have the video of. Someday I'll do another one of it, probably someday soon. Yeah, by soon, what do I mean, 2 years? I don't know. But I've played it a few times since then, and I felt pretty comfortable with it since then, including some solo plays as well as opposed. This, however, I think is a little bit more difficult to reach for, because, for example, I played the U.S. in the game I played opposed. I don't really get how to do the Jihadist. Now, and I wish I had noticed this, I had seen it when I first looked at the game, but then didn't. Buried behind the examples of play, there's this guide to operations, and then the designer's notes back here, which are also kind of interesting. But in between this example of play, which I never look at, and the event card, historical information, which I usually won't look at unless I'm curious about the historical side, because I don't want to know what all the cards are going to be. I want to be kind of surprised. And you could say, well, wait a minute, how can you play a game if you're going to be surprised? Well, that's part of why I enjoy a game. I want things to develop. I want them to see them out. I'm not a competitive gamer. I'm more interested in seeing what happens, even though I'll be trying to win. So anyway, this gives you some real kind of ideas, and I don't know if this was in the first edition, but of what the US and the Jihadists are going to try to do. And I've kind of skimmed through this to try to capture it. The rules also I've read at one point and only just skimmed them now because, you know, to tell you the truth, you read these rules and it's not that they're terribly complex or something, but you just don't really get everything from them, or at least I don't. I don't feel like I have an understanding of the game from them. But the player aids are incredibly useful, and they're what I'm going to kind of focus on. I'm not going to give a detailed explanation of the rules of the game, but I'm going to try to give a feel for the flavor of what the different operations are. For anybody who is interested in watching my videos, of especially the playthrough, and then wants to see, you know, wants to understand a little bit of what's going on. I'll probably make mistakes. I always do. Okay. But this is not the video you want to see if you're looking for, you know, the detailed how to play the game, either in terms of the rules or in terms of the overall strategy. Now let me see, do we have a sequence of play here? Well, we sort of do. So this is, we're going to be playing the initial setup of Let's Roll, and I'm going to play the campaign game, which is 3 decks, I think, unless a different victory condition comes up. And so, victory at the end of the game, well, there's instant victories. Let's touch on those first. So, for the Jihadist, he has to get 6 resources to Islamicist rule. Now, resources, I think, are these little whale things. Oh, no, they're these points up here, I do believe. Yeah, you can see how little I know. Yeah, so that these points count as resources. He's got to get 6 of them in his Islamicist role. At the beginning of the game, he has 1. Now, it's got to be poor in Islamicist, right? No, 6 in Islamicist role. Yeah, that's this marker. So if it makes it to here, he wins an automatic victory. But he also has to have them in 2 adjacent countries. There have to be 2 adjacent Islamicist rule countries. Second victory chance is the U.S. prestige has to be at 1. And he's got to have at least 15 different countries in poor Islamicist rule. At the beginning he starts with only 4. But some of them, it's not clear where they are. So all the countries that aren't allocated yet, that don't have one of these poor or fair counters on them, other than these guys who are considered to have a fixed rating, they're all going to be considered to be unknown. Events in the game can cause you to roll and see how they're governed, and that will tell you, that might up the number of those countries. So as of right now, there's only a small fragment of countries that we really know how well they're ruled. Whether or not they're just going to, you know, they may be secretly ready to collapse or something like that. Anyway, by the way, good and poor, that's largely from the U.S. standpoint. So anything under Islamicist rule is worse than poor, but poor might indicate see, it doesn't necessarily indicate an opponent. Saudi Arabia is a poor ally because there's a lot of nests of Islamicist terror cells in Saudi Arabia, even though the government itself is our ally. I'm not sure quite how well Iraq as a poor adversary really works, or Libya as a poor adversary, because even though we saw Libya collapse, Iraq probably wasn't going to collapse, and none of these countries were going to collapse had the actions that were taken after 9/11 not taken place. And these were fairly stable dictatorships at one point. Okay. And how different is Syria from Iraq? I don't know. You know, I mean, but to some extent, this represents an opposition to the U.S. policies as well. So it's not, Syria is an adversary of us in the sense that they're opposed, but the poor versus fair rating is a little harder to judge. I'm not sure that Iraq is really less well governed than Syria at this point. I'm not sure it's more of a hotbed for terror cells at this point. Saddam had a real opposition to Al-Qaeda, actually. Okay. So, let's see what we move on to. Right. We were going through the victory conditions here. The final automatic victory is if you can get a weapon of mass destruction. And at the beginning of the game, they're the Pakistan arsenal, and then these three up here, loose new Q, and I don't know what Hue is, but I can look that up, and Kazakh strain, which is probably some biological terror weapon. If you get one of those to go off in the United States successfully, you win as the jihadist. What does that mean? Well, honestly, it probably means really, really horrible things. It probably means the war against Islam might be triggered or something like that, which was really kind of the way it was framed in the Al-Qaeda side, as opposed to the other side of it, where you're really actually gaining power. But by their playbook, this would be a good thing. It probably wouldn't knock the United States out of the war overall. It would actually define it the way they wanted it defined. Now, at the end of the game, after the final reshuffle, and we keep track of that with these decks, and we're going to try playing 3. I don't know how long that's going to be. My wife and I played a moderate-sized game, maybe 2-3 hours of playing time, maybe a little bit more because we were new, and we only got halfway through the first deck. So this may take me all week to get through, but that's okay. The jihadists win if at least half of as many resources are Islamicist or green regime change as are good governance. Okay? Basically, the Islamicists have to be doing proportionally well compared to the countries that have been well stabilized. Now, we don't really we have these here and here, and that's what it's based on. Is it resources? Yeah. So there are no good countries in the Muslim world right now. The U.S. has nothing that it's really happy with. The Islamicists have their one point, which is, of course, Afghanistan. Iran's a special case, isn't really part of the game in the normal sense of things. We'll look into how that works maybe later. Okay, so now, for the U.S. to win, they need to get 12 resources up to good, and it's all nicely spelled out here as well as here. 15 countries at fair or good. And again, we don't know what those countries are. So by triggering more countries, it might be adding to the chances of that kind of victory as things become better defined. I think that's more likely to help the Islamicist player than it would be to help, because you see 1 to 4 we get poor, 5 or 6 fair on a random check. No one's going to end up good. So there's a chance. This is, first of all, closer to its value limit, which is, damned if I remember where it is. That's all the way up at 15 as well. Yeah, so I think those are pretty much stretch goals. But maybe in the long game it's possible. And then the final one is to wipe out all the enemy cells. And I was pretty close to that with my wife in the opposed play. But that's a hard task. The reason why is because when the U.S. plays a card to do anything, like in Twilight Struggle, if there's an enemy event on it, it gets triggered off. That's pretty much actually the case for the Islamicist player as well, except he's got one little place where he can hide events, which is in the first plot marker. So if he tries to export a plot or commit a plot, he can discard a card that he doesn't like the event for. And we'll see that in a moment. Okay, well, no, we won't. I'm not going to go in that much detail. The base play of the game, Jihadist takes 2 quick card actions. And this is a CDG. If you're not familiar with CDGs, well, you probably should be looking at something else as well. Twilight Struggle or 1960 are good starting choices. But what that means is that there's cards that have an operations or an event on them. When the Islamicist plays his card, he has the choice of either using the operations points to do stuff, and that's to do stuff off here, off the menu, or he has the option to trigger off the event. And the events are kind of fun because, you know, they look like they do cool stuff, especially the ones in your favor, but some of them aren't in your favor. If they're not in your favor and you play it for operations, you trigger the event for your opponent. You do get to choose whether you take your operations points or the event first, though, in those cases. There is the one exception, which is if the Islamicist plays the first plot of a turn. Of a full game turn, which is a hand of cards, basically. Not just running through here. Then they get to discard that. They get to hide that card under here, and the effect of the event doesn't take place. You also have the option to bank points off a card. Now, at the end of the game turn, if you've got banked points, they go away. But otherwise, it's sometimes useful because some things need more points than others. All right. And then the U.S. gets 2 turns, and he's got a similar situation, but he's got nowhere to hide his events. If you discard a card, though, and something, events, etc., require a discard, it gets rid of it without triggering the event. So maybe you can hope for that or get that advantage there. As to the actual events, well, the U.S. and the Jihadists play differently. For the U.S. player to play events, it's based on how well the area's ruled. Okay? So a good ruled area costs him at least a 1 card to do things in. Fair 2, poor 3. Interesting mechanism. On the other side, though, the Jihadist doesn't have the same kind of situation. For him, the card indicates how many dice he gets to roll, because most of his operations may or may not work. US-based operations pretty much just do what they do, although there are some cases where there's a die roll involved. Let's look at the different options here. So recruit. This requires you to have cells or cadres in play. And, you've got target numbers as well. So your target number is based on the governance of the country for the Jihadist player. So for example, if he played a 3-point card in Iraq, he'd get 3 cards and be looking for 3s or less. If he played the 3-point card over in Italy, he'd roll 3 dice but be looking for 1s or less. But there might be modifiers, right? Okay, so in this case, you're doing a recruit, you roll, and for each success you get, you place a cell. Oh, these should be sleepers, I believe. You place a cell in sleeper mode, which is without the little crescent and star on it, standing up. When they're up, they're activated, or actually, essentially they're known when they're flipped up with the little symbol showing, because they're up late at night and you can see their lights. Okay, but there's a limit to how many cells you can produce this way, which is based on Jihadist funding. The Jihadist funding starts up at 9. The World Trade Centers just went down. Everybody's happy to support them with money who's opposed to the U.S. But if that goes down, it means you can't bring beyond the box that they're in. So this guy, any of these boxes, I can only have 5 cells on the map. But up here, I can have all 15 cells on the map. Now that funding also affects how many cards I draw. On the U.S. side, there's a similar but different mechanism, which is however many troops you have committed to the world, are going to limit your number of cards. So at the beginning of the game, there are only 4 troops on the map. That allows me to have a 9-card hand. But if I go up to overstretched, I only get a 7-card hand. Okay. Travel. This allows you to move from somewhere in the world to anywhere else in the world. But you gotta roll dice if you want to move into a target country that's not adjacent to you. If you want to move to an adjacent one with these little lines connecting it, you can do that for free. And that's mainly what adjacency does. It affects some events too, I believe. The other effect of travel, and you can do this just to do this, is it makes an active cell a sleeper cell. It hides them. And you can do that in the same country without moving in order to keep from the penalties of being an active cell. You often want to move because it's easier to produce units somewhere and then move them somewhere else. But moving a cell into Europe is going to be kind of tricky. So you kind of want to get trigger spots over here or whatever in order to do that. Now these little symbols here, I'm trying to remember, they give you an adjacency, which is to say all these, I don't know, the Shenzhen countries or whatever, are considered adjacent by connection to these things. So if you've got, if you connect to the little EU thing, it means that you're adjacent to all the Shenzhen countries. Easier for travel in that case. Okay. Plot. Plotting, you have to pick a non-Islamicist rule country in which you have cells. For each role, yes, roles require cells in this case, and I think maybe every case. For each role that you take in a country, you have to turn a cell from passive or from sleeper to active, and you have to have a cell to do these roles. And I think that may be the same. No, recruit, I think you can do without attributing one cell to each. I'm not positive about that. For each role in a country, you must have the cells go active. The first plot operation can ignore the event, and each success allows you to place a marker from here that has some value for the plot into the country where you're plotting. Can't do it here because there's Islamicist rule, but whatever. Now, if those plot and the value of the plot that you place is based on the card you play. So if you play an Ops 2 card, you can play an Ops 2 plot. You can also drop a Weapons of Mass Destruction plot, which look just like these on the other side, no matter what kind of card you're using. But you have to get the success on the die roll. Those plots have to be caught by the U.S. or bad things will happen. So they sit in the country until the U.S. deals with them. For every success that you do, the plot gets placed in the territory. Okay. And the final and biggest sort of action is the jihad. In this, you're trying to damage the government, the governance, or remove the aid. And you can only do this in Muslim countries. There have to be cells, and it can't be an Islamicist role. For each role in the country, you have to have a cell that's already active or turn one up active. And this will be a minor jihad unless there are certain specific cases in play. Each success drops the governance one level. So, for example, you can go from fair to poor. But you cannot go down to Islamicist rule with a minor jihad. And it doesn't affect the alignment of the government itself. Each failure that you have in a jihad is going to remove one of your cells back to the track. So you have to restart. So a failed jihad loses you people. Now a major jihad is essentially an attempt to establish an Islamicist rule country. In this case, you have to target non-Islamicist ruled Muslim countries in which you have 5 or more cells more than there are troop squares. That's what these little guys are. All the cells go active. You proceed as if it's a minor jihad, but if you get it down to poor, 2 more successes, or only 1 if it's a besieged regime, turns it to an Islamicist rule. And the alignment immediately drops to adversary. Any regime change, besieged regime, and aid markers are removed. You get additional resources to your funding, and that's based on what the resources value of the country, right? And what else? The prestige for the U.S. drops down to 1. So if you topple a government as the Islamicist player, you whack U.S. prestige greatly. Now, if 3 rolls at poor, if you make 3 rolls and you're at poor and you don't shift the country to Islamicist rule, it shifts 1 box towards ally and becomes a besieged regime. That's kind of a mixed effect. I'm going to cut this and go back, add another video to this. Alright, part 2. Let's see. For the U.S., now remember, this is a little different. Their operations, they're allowed to play in countries based on the points present in the country. Now, they can't play in Islamicist rule countries for obvious reasons. They have trouble playing in some of these other countries because of the poor rule. Poor being we're restricting U.S. operations. So for example, Iraq being in poor rule, in a sense makes sense because we would have trouble doing covert operations there. Okay. So what can we do with the U.S. here? Well, one is war of ideas. This is to improve alignment and governance. You have to choose a neutral or allied Muslim country. You can't do it to an adversarial one. If it's a regime change country, you have to have at least 5 more troops available than there are cells. We don't have a regime change yet, but that's, say, the way you'd fix Afghanistan, is you'd send in an invasion, or it's the Iraqi invasion, which had a purpose of regime change. You roll on the War of Ideas table, which is over here, and you've got to get, well, essentially a 5 or a 6. A 4 is an aid, which gives you one of these little markers, which will help you on other wars of ideas. You've got a set of modifiers here. If you're attempting to shift it to good, well, whatever. Anyway, one of the factors is how far world opinion is from the U.S. position. So U.S. position is hard. At the beginning of the game, the world is hard. That's because Israel has a hard stance. The rest of the world is undefined at this point. But postures to non-Muslim countries, primarily, will let you know, hey, the rest of the world does not appreciate what you're doing. Say it's too military, and the chances are they're going to be softer than the U.S. policy. Or they're in alignment with you. Well, if they're not in alignment, there's a penalty there. U.S. prestige gives a modifier to the War of Ideas. Aid markers obviously do. Adjacent good allies do. There aren't a lot of those at the beginning, but and they have to actually be allies. You can't just say, Israel's adjacent, that'll help. No, that doesn't work. It's got to be a Muslim ally. Okay, well, let's see what happens. So there's 2 different kinds of War of Ideas here. This is the first one for alignment or governance. If you succeed, A neutral becomes an ally, or an ally goes up one level. So, for example, you could use this on Saudi Arabia to move it from poor to fair. Or you could use it on Pakistan, and it would move them from neutral to an ally. If you fail by 1 pip, which is the 4 result, you get an aid marker. But you can only have one of these. Okay, the second side of War of Ideas is used on non-Muslim countries. You target a non-Muslim country, you roll on the posture table here. If the outcome is the same as the U.S. posture, you switch the posture of the country. If the outcome is the same as the U.S. posture, you get an extra prestige. So this is usually used if the posture of one of the opposing countries, or of one of the other European or non-Muslim countries, is in the status of, in the opposite status of yours. You can flip them and you get an advantage. There's no cost for failure. Now, one thing, I want to jump to this Rec 3, and there's another one somewhere else which has a Rec on it. Rec 3 in the UK. These are places where you can actually recruit without having, without the normal status. I don't remember how that works. If rec number, roll that number or less for success. You ignore the governance. Yeah. So it becomes easier to recruit cells in, say, the United Kingdom than it is to recruit in what you'd think a good governed territory, for example, the United States would be. All right. Just wanted to catch that because I kind of missed that before. Disrupt. This is an attempt to destroy cells or a cadre, and you gain prestige from it. You target a non-Muslim country, ally, or a country with at least 2 troops. Okay? So any non-Muslim country you can act in. In Muslim countries, you have to have them an ally or have troops in them. There's a bonus to having troops here. So if the target, you're going to destroy a cell, send it back to the jihadist funding if you succeed. But if the target country has a hard posture, which will be these non-Muslim countries, you get 2 cells. If you have 2 or more troops, you get 2 cells, and you add a point of U.S. prestige for catching the people. The effective cells, okay, so active cells go back to the jihadist funding. Sleeper cells, you're activating them. You're making them easier to catch, is all you're able to do there. If you remove the last cell in a country, a little cadre marker comes, and that means there's still enough people there that the jihadist player can recruit new cells that way. And if he does, the cadre goes away. If there are no cells and you remove a cell, you get to get rid of the cadre. Alert. All right, this one is meant to stop a plot. You can only do this in a country with a plot. You have to use You have to use 3 ops to do this. It doesn't have to be a card. You can build it up through reserves, I believe. You select and reveal a plot marker. If it's a weapon of mass destruction, it's removed from the game. Otherwise, it goes back here to be available. And that can be any point plots. Now, if you don't block a plot, you deal with this. And if it's a weapon of mass destruction in the United States, the jihadist wins. If it's a weapon of mass destruction not in the U.S., funding goes to 9. You roll U.S. posture and roll prestige. Which could go either way. What do we got here? In a Muslim country, that's in the U.S. Yeah. So you could change the U.S. to a softer posture or a hard posture, conceivably. In a Muslim country or in Iran has special rules for it. You add 1 to funding. You add 2 if the country was good, If the country has troops, you reduce the prestige. If it's a weapon of mass destruction, the prestige goes to 1. If it's a Muslim country, which does not include Iran, Iran's not considered Muslim, it's considered special in this game, you roll a number of dice equal to the plot's number. 3 dice if a weapon of mass destruction. Each roll less than or equal to the country's governance worsens the governance 1 level towards poor, but you can't do Islamicist rule, and it removes an aid marker. In a non-Muslim country other than the U.S., the plot is added to the funding, twice the plot if the country's a good governance country, like one of the Schengen countries for the most part. If it's a weapon of mass destruction, you set funding up to 9. You roll posture for that country. If it's a weapon of mass destruction, the jihadist may re-roll that posture roll. If a Schengen country, the jihadist selects 2 other and rolls their posture as well. And there's a -1 prestige effect if the plot is resolved in a non-Muslim country with troops. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Yeah, apparently that's very odd. There's an event which can cause the Philippines to have troops in it. For the most part, you only send troops to Muslim countries, so we'll not worry about that. That looks like a special case. Okay, so Alert's purpose is to destroy these plots, and basically the U.S. just has to expend the effort. If they don't have the effort to expend, though, well, they've got problems. Now, to make this easier on the U.S., they're allowed to hold 1 card. If they're at their last card, they can hold it and don't have to play it. Normally you have to play a card every action phase. Now, if they hold their card and the Islamicist is out of cards, they get to keep it for their next turn. There's no limit to your hand size here. Of course, there's an effective limit because the jihadist is out of cards and can only get 9, and the U.S. can only hold 1 and can only get 9. But if events or something give you cards, your hand size could be bigger. Okay. Deploy. This allows you to move troops. You can move them to any allied Muslim country or back to the troops track. Alright. And you treat the troops track as good 1, which means it only takes a 1-point card to move troops. If from a regime change country, if you've got a regime change in place, you have to leave at least 5 more troops than there are cells there, unless you played a withdrawal event instead. And you can move any number of troops from that location on the board to the target. From one location on the board to the target. Now that location that you move from could be the troops track. But as you devote more and more troops to the war on terror, you start overstretching the U.S. capabilities and get less cards later in the game, and it can also affect some events. Regime change. This is how you get rid of, say, Afghanistan, or make a war of choice against Iraq. Purpose is to overthrow Islamicist rule and create an ally. You pick an Islamicist rule country. Ooh, you can't regime change just at random. Interesting. U.S. must be hard. There are cards, though, weapons of mass destruction cards that allow you to go into Libya or Iraq. U.S. must be hard in order to do this. And it costs a 3-ops. I think this may require you to have a 3-ops card. But if not, you can use reserves. I'd have to look that up. You can deploy at least 6 troops, and any more than that, as a deploy action. Which probably with that many, you have to do it from the troops section. All cells in that area go active. Hey, you get to try to catch them. You shift the country to allied, and you roll on governance to see whether you get fair or good or poor. You put a green regime change marker in place. Now, these are kind of weird. You got these regime change markers somewhere, and they're on the green side for 1 turn, and then they flip over to brown side. That's really an end of game factor. If the game's going to end due to the deck running out, green regime change countries don't prevent you. They count against you. So you can't just invade a country on the last turn and neutralize the points that the jihadist player has. Okay. And you make a roll on the prestige table to see if your prestige goes up or down. Withdraw. Don't like the regime change? You can get out. This isn't advisable. What you want to do is raise it up to good governance. If you do that, it stops being a regime change country. You have to be soft to do a withdrawal. And it costs you 3 operations points. You can deploy any number of troops out of the target country. You remove all aid markers, and you place a besieged regime marker and make a prestige roll. Besieged regime is not a good thing for you, but, well, sometimes you want to get your troops out of a country. Reassessment. This change the U.S. posture. You have to play 2 3-value cards, and each one of these has possible evil events on it, right? This takes up the entire U.S. action phase. You cannot use reserves on this, so I think you can use reserves on regime change and withdrawal and alert. This shifts the U.S. posture from hard to soft or soft to hard. Usually you're doing that to align yourself with the rest of the world, but there are other reasons to do it. I believe the War of Ideas, right, has some requirement or has some advantage. No, the War of Ideas advantage is to be aligned with the rest of the world. There's something that does you good if the rest of the world is aligned all the way to your side. I do not remember what that is, and I'll have to look that up. That's about it for the rules coverage that I'm going to give. There's a little bit more to the game, but basically you're going to be taking these operations, trying to reach the different victory conditions. For the most part, the play that I had, I felt like I was still kind of blundering around, just trying to, hey, can I do something? Can I react? I was doing quite well because, honestly, my wife had less of an idea of what to do than I did. But I'm hoping to maybe uncover a little bit more about the game by playing it solo here and maybe share some of that discovery with you guys through the playthroughs. Or just bore people with my voice.